Diversity in human and natural resources in Nigeria and Africa has over time tinkered with democratic and political play-out. Clearly, every area or region is shaped by the unique and peculiar interests. Therefore, understanding politicking in any domain requires paying a special attention and studying the dynamics in the peculiar entity. On the spot this week, we'll take a look at the political dynamics in Africa's largest democracy, Nigeria, and that of other countries as they affect development. I am Joseph Otsen. Welcome to the program. Now, my guest is a political scientist with national and international recognitions. He holds a bachelor's degree, master's degree, and PhD in political science, all from the University of Ibadan. He has several academic honors, distinctions, and fellowship, including Extraordinary Professor of Political Science, University of Pretoria, member United Nations Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters, and member Board of Trustees, United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. Also, he is a member National Task Team for the establishment of the then Organization of Africa Unity's Division of Conflict Resolution and establishment of the Institute for Peace Program in Nigeria. He is currently Pro-Chancellor and Chairman of Governing Council, Western Delta University, Ohara, Nigeria. On the spot is Director General, Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, Professor Eghosa Emmanuel Osaghae. Nice to have you on the spot.
Thank you very much.
Okay. At this critical time, it won't be fair to discuss anything political, international relations, without talking about what is currently happening now, the coup in Niger. What do you make of it?
For a long time, Africa was like the continent that was isolated in matters of proper governance and democracy and democratization. But beginning from the late 1980s and through the 1990s, we had those very sustained democratic struggles across the continent. And in the aftermath of those struggles, we had the dividends of democracy, as they say. So all across the continent, we had the installation of democratic regimes that replaced those non-democratic regimes that proliferated the African landscape for all of that period. So what has happened in Niger is very unfortunate. It's a sad reminder of the fact that, we still have some work to do in Africa, because Niger is coming on the back of similar situations in Guinea, in Mali, in Sudan, in Burkina Faso. So we are not quite out of the woods yet. That's what Niger represents. And it means that the time is now to review the African situation and our scorecard. They were all resolved. I think there's consensus on the fact that we need democracy by all means and by every means, and that we must halt the reversals that the kinds of things that have happened in Niger represent. Those are democratic reversals, and we as Africans, we as West Africans, we as Nigerians are saying the right things, that in fact we need concerted action to work together to ensure that we do not have these kinds of reversals.
Now, you're talking about this reversal. What is giving room to this reversal? And why peculiar these particular areas?
Now, well, there is nothing peculiar about these areas, other than to say that, where we have the failure of governance, where we have poverty in its extreme, where we have prevailing insecurity, and where we have, a dissatisfied citizenry. You can expect the kinds of upheavals that we have witnessed. So there are no easy solutions when you have countries that are in extreme poverty, countries that have resources but are not able to make use of those resources, countries that have suffered a great deal of a great deal of deprivation, over the years, and the citizens have suffered as a result. In short and in summary, the point about these kinds of unfortunate developments is something to do with the kinds of expectations that people have, the kinds of dividends that they expect, the kinds of acts of justice, that they expect, and so on. So it's not about any geographical location. It is something that, if not properly managed, can happen. But I think that one of the aspects that should be of concern to everyone is the frequency with which these things happen.
That's my concern too.
In resource-rich countries. Resource-rich countries. It does appear, for a long time, in the field of political science, we used to talk about the resource curse. Resource curse meaning that, we have countries that are very rich in resources, but somehow are not able to make optimal use of those resources. And that, if anything, the counter happens to be the more prominent feature of these countries, that these resources then become the source of conflicts and wars, especially civil wars. And we've witnessed that all over. If you look at, Sierra Leone and Liberia and the Congo and the search for diamonds and so on, even oil. So where we've had these resources, we've had a lot of interests, a lot of it domestic, a lot of it also external. And when these things, play out in their dynamics, we move from just being resource curse as a domestic factor to resource curse as being the trigger, for perennial conflicts and crisis. That's on the one hand. And then you have, resources that are not being properly governed, and you have internal and external interests. The resource cost also becomes such a huge factor.
Okay, a lot of people have blamed this on the foreign interests, foreign countries playing a huge part. But a question a lot of people will ask is, why are we Africans, African leaders, finding it very difficult to have control over their territories and determine how they project their own continent and harness their own resources for their own well-being?
So first, our countries, many of them, are very poor. And when you're poor, there are many things that you are not able to do. You cannot provide for the welfare of citizens. You cannot even meet the basic requirements, that would make governance, effective. Many of these countries are heavily indebted. They owe huge debts, and we don't know how they are going to be able to pay. But indebted countries also are countries that are subject to conditionalities and all kinds of things put their way by their creditors. That's the one. But when you also have very weak institutions, over time we've had institutions that we have struggled to install and to make effective and strong. When those things are not working the way they should work, they have, reduced capacities, to cope with the demands and challenges of management and governance in the public space. When you then add on top of that the external interests, that seem to play out all the time. I mean, in this part of the world today, in Africa, we're in the throes of, some kinds of what some regard as the return to the kinds of politics of the Cold War era, where the world, follows lines of division that are not determined by us, but which have very adverse effects, on Africa. If you take the conflict in the war in Ukraine, for instance, it's been very costly. The energy crisis that we have across the world, the food insecurities that we've had, the many of such issues, and not to mention the effects of the war on human migration and then human populations. Now, all of these things have been devastating for Africa. And you will know that these are not things that Africans have control over. So the point is, you need a lot of resources to be able to face the challenges that we have. And there are no easy choices or options.
Most of these countries are neighboring countries. How much of this will play out in Nigeria?
No, well, the first thing is to understand the character of conflicts, of wars, of terrorism, food insecurity, human migration, to understand the transnationality, of these flows. There's a proliferation of light weapons and small arms. There's a proliferation of illicit drugs. There's a proliferation of human trafficking. There is, in the face of all of these global flows, we are challenged to build even stronger institutions and have stronger regulations, such as border controls and so on. But very few countries have the capacity, to build strong borders and so on. In Nigeria, we have tried, closing borders and shutting them. But we know that those things cannot become the permanent solution to the kinds of problems we're facing. So it's right, what happens in other countries, especially neighboring countries, are bound to affect us in Nigeria. And you have seen this, in the Sahel region, the kinds of flows that we've had, the cells, the kinds of networks, that go on, mean that what happens in Nigeria, what happens in Mali, what happens in Burkina Faso, what happens in Chad, what happens in Niger, what happens in Cameroon, would be of consequence to Nigeria.
Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. Give us an insight first. Let's now understand what it stands for.
The Nigerian Institute of International Affairs was founded in November 1961. That means the NIIA is 62 years old by November 2023. The institute was established to promote the understanding of international affairs and encourage the understanding by Nigerians of citizens of other countries and the dynamics of international politics. But the Institute has also served over the years as a think tank for foreign policy for the federal government. So if you like, you can say that the NI is the official advisory think tank on foreign policy for the federal government of Nigeria. Now, the NIA has been at the forefront of conducting research on the different aspects of international politics. The Institute is organized into divisions for research purposes. We have the Division of Peace and Conflict. We have a division for African integration. We have a division for international law. We have a division for international institutions and organizations. And most recently, we have extended the frontiers of understanding into new spheres. So we now have regional units that specialize in looking at, for instance, Asian studies, European studies, and so on. We have a sports diplomacy unit. We have a science diplomacy unit. And we are now also moving in the direction of digital diplomacy. The NIA's work, of course, is conducted by a core team of researchers in these various fields that I've identified, who have made their contributions over the years to the enhancement of Nigeria's engagement with international politics. The NIA works in close collaboration with several organizations within the country and outside Nigeria. So it is at the forefront of building international networks. But let me just say that the NIA has also been of such great value to foreign policy in Nigeria. As you may know, the NIA has had very distinguished directors general in the past. One of them was Professor Bolaji Akinyemi, who formulated and enunciated the notion of a concert of medium powers. The whole idea in the concert of medium powers is to say that as you have the superpowers, so you also have medium powers. So what the non-aligned movement tried to do in the past, and after its demise created some kind of hiatus, was what that concept meant to fill as a gap. And today, when we talk BRICS and Mint, the G20 and so on, these are things that are modeled after the concept of medium powers. The NIA also had its own very strong contributions to the debate on structural adjustment and insisted on the African perspectives on structural adjustment that were not exactly the kinds of things that the Bretton Woods institutions, were projecting at the time. And every time you've looked at foreign policy, you have seen that the NIA has had very direct input into this. So Professor Bolaji Akinyemi went from being DG to becoming Minister of External Affairs, as it was then known. We had Professor Agbola Gambari, who was DG and moved on to become Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he was most recently the Chief of Staff to the former president. And we've had Professor Joy Ogu, who was also DG, moving on to becoming the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Nigeria's permanent representative at the United Nations. So all told, you would say, that's, the NIA has been of such great value to the Nigerian foreign policy scene. Okay,
it sounds like that good, but there I've also heard arguments that Nigerian foreign policies, especially among our African countries, Nigeria seems to be giving so much, but it takes very little from that.
That cannot be correct at all.
Okay.
If you put any value, on what you regard as returns on investment, you would see that Nigeria is applauded as Africa's clear leader. Nigeria not only has the biggest population on the continent, Nigeria has the biggest economy. Nigeria has been in the forefront of the anti-colonization movement in Africa. Nigeria was not going to rest on its arse until the entire continent of Africa was liberated from the forces of colonialism. And you know that Nigeria did so much, especially in the last vestiges of colonialism in Southern Africa, that we became, a frontline state.
I think that's where a lot of people argue about. We are talking about what we have done for other African countries, what we have done. What is our own gain?
Many, many gains, and this is the point.
You saw the reaction of South Africa when some Nigerians were chased away from South Africa.
No, that's a different contemplation altogether.
Even Ghana, our neighbors here,
those are different. Issues with that. Those are different.
When we stand for these countries, we expect that they should recognize that this is what they have done for Nigeria.
Those are different contemplations.
Okay.
The compensations that we have had are very well established. Nigeria's strength in the multilateral organizations is the opportunity that these countries have to pay back, if that's what you are asking for. The kinds of things that have gone on in several international organizations, where Nigeria has held sway and so on. These things are some of the dividends that we have for the sacrifices we've made for the rest of Africa. And if you go to Liberia or Sierra Leone or even Guinea-Bissau and see the kinds of reception that Nigeria has had in these countries at the level of the attitudinal, responses of individual citizens. So even if you take citizen-to-citizen diplomacy, the kinds of relations that we have across the continent, Nigeria is a big name, for all of the people in the continent. And you would find, that in Nollywood, for instance. You will find that in sports. You will find that in all the things that we do. But even more directly to answer your question, if you go across Africa today, it's unlikely you will come across any country where you don't find a Nigerian bank. Nigerian banks are all over the place. And this is a recognition and an acknowledgement of the very strong leadership that Nigeria has provided. Nigeria is a clear leader in the technological breakthroughs, in fintech, in the financial sector, in the service sector, and that's acknowledged all across Africa. So what we have done is to let Africa know, that when Nigeria is at its best, then Africa is at its best. Nelson Mandela made the point that it is the day Nigeria finally rises up to that occasion that Africa will rise up.
Okay, we acknowledge that Big Brother Africa.
No, it's more than Big Brother Africa. It's more than Big Brother Africa. Okay. Yes, because if I may just make that point, for a long time, South Africa also had, the aspiration along those lines to play the kinds of roles that Nigeria has played over time. But when it came to the realm of actually doing, there were realizations that what Nigeria was doing was not simply to aspire, that Nigeria actually devoted resources, to doing things, and that's known even in South Africa itself.
It's okay. That's what quite acknowledge our leaders, political leaders. Many of them, from their interactions, and a lot of people argue that they don't have the basic understanding of international diplomacy and so on. How much of this is it necessary that we have a kind of make something compulsory for some of our political holders or public office holders to have a kind of a knowledge of international relations and so on?
Well, yes, that's part of the responsibility that the NI has, building capacities and skills that people require for engaging with the international community, building art and science of diplomacy, which we do. So we offer training programs and capacity building workshops, for all peoples across, the entire spectrum of public service, not only for foreign affairs officials, but also for the security agencies, for instance, because increasingly now you find that we are saying we need a greater focus on the non-kinetic methods of conflict resolution and so on. In the fight against terrorism, we need that. Even in the art of diplomacy itself, the kind of thing we are doing presently in Niger, we are saying, the non-kinetic actions can be as effective, if not more effective. That's part of the role of the NI. And let me just say that the latest addition that the NI has is a Center for Early Warning Systems. We have the General Leo Irabo Early Warning Systems Center that is collaborating with similar institutions across the world And what we're doing is to see how we can strengthen our capacities to have the proper interpretations given to early warning signals, so we can prevent conflicts and we can prevent acts of insecurity and so on and so on. So the NIA is fully conscious of these responsibilities and is going all out to build capacities and skills, not only for Nigeria, but across West Africa and Africa.
It's all right. Thank you very much, Professor Eghosa Emmanuel Osaghae, Director General, Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, for being on the spot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's all right. So that's it on the spot for this week. Thank you very much, viewer, for keeping tab with us. Goodbye.